Hello, Stampers. This is Yana Smakula. Welcome back for another Hero Arts video. In this one, which is a part of the color layering series, we're taking a closer look at the color layering Betta fish stamp set. Join me as I test several color options and layer options, and also show you how to create a wet fish look on your cards. Here's a quick look at this stamp set. It features 3 fish layers, an outline, an almost solid layer, and a detail layer. There are also several sentiments to choose from. I love when there are fun coordinating sentiments included with these layering sets, and Hero Arts is always so great at coming up with the best messages to pair with these images. There's also an image of air bubbles and seagrass to help you create a scene. I'm starting with the outline layer and going to stamp it in black ink. This is intensified black on white paper. All of my fish are going to have a black outline, but as always with these color layering sets, you can use the darkest color for your outline for a slightly softer look. For example, if you stamp your fish in blue, use Hero Arts navy ink, which is the darkest blue, in the line to stamp the outline instead of using black. Next, I'm going to stamp the solid layer. It is very easy to align it once you have the outline stamped. I'm using my Misty Stamp Positioner today to help me get great impressions, and if you don't have this tool yet, I can't recommend it enough. I'm using soft pool color for a very light blue-green solid layer. The solid layer actually has gaps in it to preserve the highlights in your fish. If you stamp on white paper, these highlights will remain white and will add a lot more contrast to your finished piece. On the other fish, I'm using Soft Sky for a light blue layer. I'm stamping it twice to have a little bit of a darker color on the image. Next, we need to add the detail layer to complete the fish. This one is, again, very easy to align. I haven't had any problems at all here, and I'm stamping it in mint julep to emerald green ombre to add interest. If you've been a follower of the color layering series, you know that using ombre ink pads is my jam when stamping these color layering images. Using an ombre ink pad adds a ton of interest and more details as opposed to stamping the image in just regular ink. For the other fish, I'm using pool to navy ombre. Okay, I have also stamped some seagrass using Hero Arts intensified black ink, and I'm going to color these using my Copic markers. The marker colors I'm using are YG03, YG25, and G99. You can color these any other medium you like. If you aren't into coloring, you can simply stamp these on colored cardstock or ink blend them to add color. The choice is yours. I don't mind doing a little bit of coloring now and then. To create the cards, I also need to work on backgrounds for my little fish scenes. Luckily, Hero Arts has many wonderful background stamps that can be used to create all sorts of fun backgrounds. To create an illusion of an extra layer on my cards without actually adding any additional layer and creating bulk, I'm using washi tape to mask 1/4 inch off the edges of this Paradise cardstock panel. This also does double duty as it helps to hold the paper in place in my Misty tool when stamping a 6x6 cling background over it. Here I'm using an older Bubbles Bold Prints background stamp. Sadly, it's been discontinued, but Hero Arts has many other sea-themed background stamps that are simply perfect to use with a Betta fish, and I'll show you one in just a minute. I've treated my paper with an anti-static powder tool and have inked the stamp using Hero Arts clear embossing ink. After stamping it on the panel, I'm covering it with white detail embossing powder and heat setting it to melt the powder in place. To help draw the eye of the viewer to the center of the panel, where my little scene is going to be, I'm also going to add some light ink blending around the edges. For this, I'm using tidepool ink and my round ink blending tool. The blending is very subtle, but it adds nice interest to the background. I'm also using a lightly darker Antigua ink, but barely going past the edges of the panel to darken them up a bit. With the ink blending done, we can peel the tape and reveal our background. I love the way this turned out, and I cannot wait to use it to make a card. To create a sentiment for this project, I'm using Kiwi cardstock and stamping on the sentiment. This one reads, "There's nobody better than you," and I'm stamping it in clear embossing ink, covering with that same white detail embossing powder and heat setting it to melt. This will create a sentiment panel for my card. Having trimmed the panel, I'm now ready to assemble my project. I'm using a mix of foam adhesive squares and glue to adhere the elements in place. I want to add some dimension to this card, but not too much. So I'm alternating between using glue and foam adhesive here to pop the fish and seagrass up. Finally, I coated some of the bubbles on the background using Hero Art's lacquer pen to create a raised dimensional look. Now remember that second fish that we stamped in darker blue? To create a background for this fish, I'm using Hero Art's reactive inks and just making blocks of color on white paper. Starting with Splash, then adding Key Lime, and finishing up with Pool Party. This is a very easy way to create a clean and simple looking background without any additional supplies. We all have ink in our stash, and making blocked backgrounds like this using ink pads is really easy. I placed this panel inside my Misty tool, arranged the fish and sentiment over it, and stamped both in intensified black ink. You could have stamped just the sentiment, skipping the fish, but I wanted to have the fish outline on the background as well. You'll see what I mean in just a second. With my fish and sentiment stamped, I can now add some air bubbles, and I want them to look as if they're going behind the fish. Having stamped the fish outline is very helpful here, as it tells me where the other elements on this card need to go. To finish this card, I foam mounted the background on an A2 white card base. I trimmed it to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I also foam mounted the blue fish over it. I added some details to the air bubbles using a white pen. I colored some of the air bubbles white, using a lacquer pen to coat some of the air bubbles, and finally, I'm adding some sequins in Ombre Ocean. For my last card for today, I'm stamping my Betta fish in shades of pink, using soft pink for the base layer and ultra pink for the detail layer. Notice that I kept the base layer stamp inside my Misty, and I did not remove the stamp. I did that on purpose to be able to stamp the base layer again later, but in clear embossing ink. Having finished stamping the detail layer, I'm now going back to that base layer and stamping it in embossing ink to be able to add embossing powder over it. I'm doing this to create a wet look. I'm going to cover the fish with sparkle embossing powder and heat set it. This will create a beautiful, wet, sparkly look, very fitting for a fish. Now, since this embossing powder, sparkle, has glitter particles in it, I prefer to heat it up or emboss it from the back of my paper. This prevents glitter from flying all over my work surface. And here's our little fish, all nice and shiny, ready to go on a card. I also stamped seagrass, and to have it match in color to the rest of the card, I'm coloring it using my pink Copic markers. The colors I'm using are RV11 and RV34. Now, I did mention this before, but there are coordinating dies available, so I'm using mine to cut the images out. To create a background for this card, I used the same masking trick as before, but this time I used Abstract Waves background. I didn't do any ink blending this time. I foam mounted the fish in the center of the panel and added "You're My Betta Half" sentiment stamped in black on white paper. Next, I cut one of the seagrass images apart to use as 2 shorter pieces and adhere them in place with the help of foam adhesive. The last piece was adhered using glue. Finally, I stamped and cut out a few air bubbles and added a couple of white sequins from the champagne sequin mix. Here's a look at the 3 cards made using Hero Art's color layering Betta fish stamp set. I hope this video has given you some stamping ideas to try with your color layering sets from Hero Arts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.